and African Americans. Today, we are dealing with the science of the Moors. Who are the Moors? This is one of the most difficult of historical questions, and in fact, this is the most neglected chapter in black history. When the generals were surrendering, the Moorish generals were surrendering in 1492, the very year Columbus sailed to the Caribbean, a painting was drawn of these generals. These were the Almohade generals. Almohade, the fourth of the last of four dynasties in Spain, had come to an end, had come to grief, in fact, in their last stronghold, Granada. And when the Castilian Spanish were defeating the Moors, a painting was done of the defeat, and there were black generals surrendering. What were they surrendering if they were not in charge? The story of the Moors, however, is extremely complex. But before I begin to talk about it, I just want to say something that fills me at the moment. Because one of the things that I remember is the way I felt after I finished writing They Came Before Columbus. I had spent 7 years, and even though I was teaching, moving about, etc., I literally lived in that book. I lived in my head for 7 years. And coming out of it was very strange to me because I was looking at people differently, I was looking at a great lot of things differently, and I was not surprised that I was attacked. And I responded with great force. I don't know where my attackers are now. But one thing that struck me with tremendous force was the feeling of absolute loneliness. I knew very few of the people here. I did not know much about, I never met Ben Yochanan. I had met, I think, John Clark. I never met Chancellor Williams. I had read his work, etc. But I had lived in isolation. In order to do my work, I lived in total isolation. I had a habit from early of cutting myself off for years without seeing anyone. And that is what I did. After these years, these 12 years since They Came Before Columbus, one of the things I can say is that we are not alone anymore. What we have now is a crusade. This is not the lonely struggle it was. We have a crusade. We have a tremendous body of people all over the country who are moving in a certain direction. I traveled quite a lot. In February alone, I was in 18 states. And one goes before many audiences, all types of audiences. I was a keynote speaker, for example, at NASA a few weeks ago, where I had to speak before the space scientists, both white and black space scientists, and they were very worried about the question of the survival of the space program and the survival of sophisticated science in this country, because we are in a very desperate state where we are not producing enough scientists. And the head of the space program was pointing out that in the 21st century, we have to make a tremendous appeal to blacks and Hispanics, because if we cannot recruit them into the field of science, we will not be able to maintain the level we have maintained before. And in fact, so serious is this problem that we're trying to build smart computers that would crystallize the genius of those great scientists that are likely to die and retire within the next few years. And we hope that the computers will be smart enough to have the insights of these great scientists. I don't think that will happen. So that we have got to realize that we have got to become aware of how important it is. We are living in a very different world. We are living in a world where there are more computers than people. That point was reached in 1982 when Bell Labs reported there were more than 4 billion computers on Earth, and there are not yet 4 billion people. So we are living in a world that is going to change dramatically, and a world in which we have to become very much aware of the power and capacity we have both for improving life and destroying it. And at the moment, many people who are in charge of science, in spite of the fact that it advances the world, or really the great majority of the world, still becomes poorer and poorer. So it really depends on a different kind of consciousness. We're not just intent on improving our technology, but improving the kind of human being that controls that technology. Because in the final analysis, civilization is not technology. Civilization is the humanization of the human. And if therefore, as that technology advances, the human shrinks, then that technology will destroy the human. This, in fact, we saw very clearly in the war, where the Germans were tops. They were the marvelous great scientists. When I was being driven to speak at NASA, one of the NASA scientists was explaining to me that if they had not seized half of the German scientists, they would have no space program. The Russians seized half and the Americans seized half. So it was Hitler's scientists that made it possible for us to get into space so quickly. But what happened to the Germans? They were these marvelous people, advanced technologically, but they had become brutes, barbarians. So that we have to become aware of the fact that civilization has advanced and become more sophisticated with that technology. This is our chance. And we have got to look very seriously at our history, because it is only through history that we can become aware of our enormous contribution and become confident of what we can do and what we cannot do. That is the most important thing. Our young people, and when I say young, I mean people up to 50. That is very young in the modern world. Gorbachev, for example, who is now in charge of Russia, is considered to be one of the most extraordinarily young men of the world. Leaders are usually in their 70s and 80s. It is very unusual to find a man close on 60 who's a leader, a major leader. That is a very young man. And that is something that I have to stress, because I am very startled by people who, by the time they're in their mid-20s, because they didn't get a break, they say, well, I've had it. I lost my chance. When I was 28, I entered university. I got my BA at 32. And I was no special student. When I was 9, I was struck by a terrible disease which killed half of my country. I lost all my friends. Part of my brain was damaged. It didn't stop me, and it didn't make me think that, oh, I am lost, it's all over. I hear this over and over again. I even hear people going about talking about, hey, AIDS will kill all of us. That is pure nonsense, defeatist thinking, because Europe was struck by a disease worse than AIDS. It killed half the European population. And it was not like AIDS, where it was restricted for a long time to a few people. Every morning when the Europeans woke up in certain parts of Europe, the way we collect garbage, they collected bodies. Everybody, every household was struck by that disease. So you have to understand that, and they did not have the science we have today, where we could say, well, in 5 or 10 years we will find a cure. There was no cure. It had to live itself out. It had to destroy, practically wiped out the population of Europe. So we have got to realize that if we are going to go back into history, we have got to use it as a force, as a positive force. History is such a force. It is like a religious thing. You become aware of these shattered fragments and parts of ourselves so that you could make yourself whole again. You cannot make yourself whole again by brooding 100% of the time on the darkness of the world. We are the light of the world. There was Jesus standing there, and he knew that the Roman Empire seemed to be all powerful. He knew that he was no man of great political power. He controlled no government. He was not even a mayor. He was not in any university. What did he have? Where did his strength lie? It lay in some great spiritual force, which in fact was to turn the world upside down. The very Romans who were in charge of the world, they were the people who were to become the first major European force that was to become subverted by Christianity. Do you know what they felt as they sat there and they looked out at these Christians, these ridiculous people who believed in life after death and things like that, and they looked at them and they saw them going to the lion, some of them with smiles on their faces. Do you know what it is to have all the power in the world and sit there shaking, and to see men strong enough to face lions? Then you become aware of an enormous power on earth, a tremendous moral force. That moral force fades in and fails in people when they lose a sense of their worth. And they lose a sense of their worth when they begin to crucify their imagination. They begin to destroy something inside of them by constantly brooding on the worst aspects. You must be aware of the terror of your world. No doubt about that. You cannot go about in a dream. But the terror of the world is what should give you strength. That is the test of faith, the test of force. It is not something that is supposed to defeat you. It is something that is supposed to push you into a new life, a new situation. Everything that you possess, all the imagination and energy and faith must be brought to bear when you face that darkness. It is not intended for the human to succumb in darkness. It is intended for the human to rise and transcend over darkness. That is the meaning of the resurrection and the life. If we did not do that, if the black had not done that, the black would have disappeared, because no attempt to destroy a race has been so continuous, so systematic, so extraordinary, and yet that race survives. It not only survives, but it speaks with fantastic new vigor and power and confidence. We are involved in a restructuring of history. Even those who are powerful in their academies find they're being subverted. I speak now more and more to professors who 10 years ago would have torn me to pieces. Now they sit quietly, trembling, knowing that these ideas are like viruses, that you cannot contain them anymore, and they're here, unlike AIDS, there is no vaccine. So that we are involved in a struggle in which we will win. And one of the struggles is to make us aware of the fantastic capacity and potential that lay in our world. The Moorish story is one of the most hopeful stories on earth. Who are these Moors? The word Moor comes from Moros, which means dark, which the Greeks used, and then the Romans made it Mores, and then some people say it also came from Meroe. Moor came from Meroe. When Shakespeare uses it, he means black. Whether it is Othello, or whether it is the figure in Titus Andronicus, he sees the Moor as black. Not all the Moors were black. What really happened is that Arabia at first was completely black. Later it was invaded by Asiatic or Semitic types. By the time of Muhammad it was only 10% black. But the Arabians or the Arabs are not the only Moors. But let us first, before we come into the question of who are the Moors, because the Moors, of their 4 dynasties in Europe, 2 of them were overwhelmingly black. They were developed in Africa, and the first 2 had a very powerful and dominant black element. But how did this begin? How come black people invaded Europe? Because most of us know Europe invaded black countries, but very few of us are aware that blacks invaded Europe. And we have to make a comparison between the black invasion and the white invasion, because they're very different types of invasion. The black invasion enriched, lifted Europe, even though as all invasions there must have been some kind of punishment, but the white invasion sought to destroy utterly the cultures and language, even the humanity of the people they invaded. All invasions are not the same. When the Greeks, the first great Europeans, invaded Africa, they did not despise Africans. Even though they invaded them, they were spiritually invaded by the Africans. Culturally invaded by the Africans, because the Europeans, the first Europeans who invaded Africa, this is before the slave trade, did not make slaves of the Africans. They made them their teachers. The Greeks, when they saw what the Africans had done, could not believe that Africa could be so advanced. They could not believe their arithmetic and their geometry and their calendars and their clocks and their medicine, even their religious system. Many of the goddesses that were taken into Europe were black goddesses. They worshipped the black woman. They worshipped the genius of the black man. The European never said anything against blackness at that point in time. In fact, he went overboard worshipping blackness. He made the goddess of wisdom black, Minerva, the goddess of chastity black, Artemis. Andromeda, who was to marry the great Greek hero, was painted black in the initial Greek vases. Circe, the enchantress in the Odyssey, was a black woman with African features. Medea, who had Jason win the golden fleece, she was painted black on Grecian vases. Isis, the sister wife of Osiris, was worshipped by Europeans just as Africans had worshipped her. Imhotep, who was known as Imhotep among the Greeks, was worshipped as a god. It's the great black multi-genius Imhotep. And every major Greek scholar went to Africa to study. Thales of Miletus, Democritus, Pythagoras, Eudoxus, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Heraclitus, they all poured into Egypt. Alexander built his city in Africa. So Africa was considered to be a cradle of civilization. There was no doubt about this. The doubts about this only began around the 18th century, when slavery had been put in this place. People started to, their Christian conscience started to be gnawed. How come these Greeks, who are our mentors, who are the fountainhead of European civilization, how come they keep insisting they got this from the black Egyptians? Surely Egyptians can't be blacks, because these are our blacks, they're our servants. How can we feel good if these are equal people like us, who in fact, before we enslaved them, actually have done things in advance of us? It doesn't sit well in our conscience. Therefore, there must be a mistake here. Black people cannot be the same black Egyptians. Therefore, something went wrong. Perhaps the Greeks didn't see well. Perhaps they got so excited about black people, they wrote down the wrong thing. They were subjective. Perhaps they weren't really talking about true black people. They were talking about white people burnt black. All sorts of excuses, and then a whole body of people got into the act. If you're black, you have to have a skull shaped like so-and-so. This skull is not like that. This nigger is not black. It's amazing. You see some of these debates, you want to really know. These are highly intelligent people, like Vorkuta, for whom I have an enormous respect at UNESCO in 1974 in Cairo. He said, okay, it is quite clear that the writing is African, the culture is African, techno-complexes Soderbergh has showed us is African. The languages Diop has showed us is African. We still have the problem, how many of these people are African? It's a very serious matter, because you would think that as one becomes wiser and wiser and more academic and more scientific, that you lose this emotional attachment to things. No, sir. When it comes to power, thank you. When it comes to power, relationships, and when it comes to being challenged deep inside the system, right in one's guts, one does not sleep at night, knowing that you are crushing and oppressing a brother who is not only equal, but who at one time had given you critical elements in your civilization. You cannot sleep with that, therefore you have to prove to your satisfaction so that you can sleep peacefully again, that that is not really a brother. It's just like when I was in Guyana, I heard of this marvelous man, this South African, very liberal South African. Strange how I forget these names of these hypocrites. What is it? Schweitzer? Yes. He said, the Negro is my brother, but he's my younger brother by several centuries. What a beautiful phrase. And we really took that. We thought that was really a compliment. At least, even though we were his younger brother by several, we were still his brother. So we felt we had joined the human family again. That is the horror of it. And we find when we go through Spanish history, no major Spanish scholar will allow you to talk about the Moors for more than half an hour. They get angrier and angrier. That is one aspect of European history that is swept under the carpet. They would not talk about that because that has haunted the generation after generation, the Spanish, the Sicilians, the Portuguese. It haunted them for centuries because the Moors did not just go in and come out. The Moors went in 711 AD. They were not totally defeated until 1492. The Moorish occupation of Europe was longer than the European slave trade. But it was not a slave trade like the European. When the Moors entered Europe, they did not destroy its culture. They did not stop the people from speaking their language. They did not put them in chains. They did not take them out of schools. They did not rid them of their sense of humanity. They did not rid them of the sense of equality. So do not compare the Moorish conquest with the European conquest of Africa. Because it's the one thing to invade, as I told you, when the Greeks invaded Egypt, it was a different type of invasion. They took it over, yes, and for a while they controlled it, but they didn't seek to destroy its culture. They fed on it. They were enriched by it. And we will see the story of the Moors as an enrichment of Europe. Europe, because of the Black Death and of things that went before that and after that, had fallen into a dark age. Greece and Rome, the glory of Greece and Rome had faded. And when the Africans and Arabs attacked Europe in 711 AD, Europe had two universities. The Muslims, the Muslim Moors, the Islamic Moors, introduced 17 universities in Europe. 17. Europe had two. Europe was 99% illiterate. 99% illiterate. Even some of the medieval European kings and queens did not write or read. But who are the Moors? How did this all start? It started in a sense with Muhammad. Therefore, we have to say something about him. Who is he? Muhammad, like Jesus, was a very extraordinary man. He transcended the race or sect in which he was born. He developed a universal religion. First of all, he accepted Jesus. Jesus, by the way, is part of the pantheon of prophets in Islam. They did not reject Jesus. Muhammad saw Jesus as a great prophet. He only saw himself as the last of the prophets. Muhammad also encouraged commerce. That attracted the townspeople. Muhammad insisted on equality and brotherhood among all men. He made a black man his right-hand man, Bilal. And he actually talked to the fair-skinned Arabs, because they were both dark-skinned and fair-skinned Arabians, that they should not treat their darker brethren with contempt. He insisted on racial equality, and he established that in his own life by making Bilal his black right-hand man. Muhammad also insisted on conquest, that we should go out into the world and conquer it, not destroy the people, but teach them a new life, bring them that religion. And he also did not seek to destroy the indigenous cultures, where he saw an indigenous culture where the Muslims entered and they saw indigenous culture. Even though they would bring their ideas, they did not completely seek to swing it around. For example, when in Walata, for example, one of the African places where Ibn Battuta visited, he went in and found that even though the Africans call themselves Muslims and they observed the festival days and various things, they still kept up their own cultural observances side by side. It's very important to note that, because many people wonder, why did Islam become so powerful? Because Islam has more converts than Christianity. It's hard to believe that, but it is true. And at that time in the world, Muhammad was just as unfortunate as Jesus. He was born among very bigoted little people, narrow-minded people. Now, I'm not saying anything against the Arabs or the Jews. People are people. People are usually narrow-minded and bigoted until a great leader arises among them and transforms them. Muhammad, in fact, nearly lost his life, because the little warring Arab tribes did not fully understand the nature of his mission, and some of them tried to kill him. Where did he flee? Into Ethiopia. And there, the beginning of the years in Islamic time begins. 622 AD, the time of the flight known as the Hegira. Now, the birth of Muhammad was around 571 AD, the flight was around 622, and he died in 632 AD. After he died, a fight broke out among the Muslims, because the Sunnis and the Shiites, there was a quarrel about hereditary succession and succession by merit, etc., and as a result of that, they split. That split has haunted the Muslim world up to this day, the Sunnis and the Shiites, and you will see how, in fact, it was to affect the Moorish occupation. Now, the Arabians then charged down into various parts of the world. Now, what was Africa at that time? Africa, the Moorish, most of the Moors, the Arabians came down into parts of Africa and started to try to turn people into Muslims. Some Africans resisted, some of them accepted Islam. Some of them, the kings would make lip service to Islam, but they would not allow Islam to affect the common people. Whatever form it took in various parts of Africa, a fusion occurred between the black Moors, the Garamantes of the Sahara, who became very powerful. In fact, the Romans found they could not defeat them. They had chariots and their javelin throwers, etc. They became a very powerful, sophisticated people. At first, farming and then building cities, etc. Those were largely the black Moors. However, there came another type, Libyans, etc., people who had come into the Sahara, fair-skinned Libyans who had mixed with black types. So you have both the mixed or tawny Moors and you have the blacker Moors. Into this came the Arabian, some of them fair-skinned, some of them dark, some of them becoming dark through intermixing with the women of the Garamantes and other African people. So it was a very mixed bunch. But when they attacked Spain in 711 AD, out of 7,000 troops, 6,000 were black Africans. Now, why did they attack Europe in the first place? Now, the Moors were intent, the Muslims were intent on conquering as much of the world as they could in order to bring their religion into the world, just as the Christians earlier in the Crusades had tried to conquer as much of the world as they could in order to bring Christianity to various people. Well, the Muslims advanced in various places. They advanced into India, they advanced into China. Even to this day, you have many Muslims in India, you have many Muslims in China. In my country, half the people are Muslims and Hindus, and the other half are Christians. Okay, so that they advanced into various countries bringing their religion, and they went into Africa into marrying with various African people. They formed various states. In North Africa, there was a battle going on between the Muslim forces and someone by the name of Count Julian. There was a little Greek outpost called Ceuta on the edge of Morocco, and they kept fighting, but they could not conquer it because even though it was small, it was almost indestructible. And eventually, however, Count Julian had sent his daughter to Spain. Spain was ruled by the Visigoths under King Roderick, and Roderick seduced Count Julian's daughter. Count Julian got very upset about it and decided to join with the Africans and the Arabs, gave them ships and showed them how to get across at a vulnerable point. The first man to enter Spain, though he did not attack, was Tarif. That's how we get the term Tarif. Okay, because he actually imposed a duty. He went into Gibraltar, he imposed a duty on various places he went into, and that's how we get the word Tarif. He was followed by another man by the name of Tariq. Tariq led 7,000 troops, 6,000 African, 1,000 other types, Berbers, Libyans, Arabians, etc., up into Europe, and they defeated Spain. Within a short span of time, the Africans and the Arabs conquered a vast part of Europe from Spain right through to the Pyrenees. In a very short space of time, they took over Sicily, Spain, Portugal. They took also a small part of France, though in France they had a very difficult time. General Martel repulsed them in France, so they got a very small slice of France. They set up courts. They set up courts in Africa, North Africa, and they set up courts in Europe. Now, because of the ideas of equality and brotherhood, they did not seek to make slaves of these people. Some Arabs, and it has to be pointed out, that the marvelous Sunni Abdul Rahman, Sunni Muslim, although he did not participate in the slave trade, some of the Arabs and Jews did start a white slave trade. Okay, so that you have some white women who were taken as slaves and sent to other countries. But on the whole, you had an insistence by law that the Jew, the Muslim, and the Christian should be treated alike. They did not destroy their legal system. They did not destroy their language. But they brought a whole body of new things into Europe. Europe did not have a single paved street at that time. Europe did not have a single lamp in its streets. Europe did not have a single public library, only private libraries for the elite. Europe did not have a single public market. There were one or two, yes, but they were not institutionalized body of public markets. They did not have public baths. All of these things were brought in by the Moors. And everything that could be translated in the world out of Egypt, which the Arabs conquered in 638 AD, out of India, out of China, out of the universities in Africa like Timbuktu, Sankore, and a range of other universities in Africa, out of ancient Greece and Rome, which had lost for a long time much of its sciences. These things were revived, translated, and brought up into Europe. Europe had 2 universities. The Moors introduced 17 universities into Europe. Europe was 99% illiterate, so was the rest of the world. A few people wrote and read in Africa, a few people wrote and read in Europe, a few people wrote and read in Asia, the same thing in America. I want you to note that Africa was not backward in relation to Europe. Africa had as many scripts as Europe. Let me repeat. Africa had the Meroitic script. It had the hieroglyphic script. It had the Akan script, both a drum script and a written script. It had the Mande script, which we find at Udmurtetek even 5,000 years ago. It had the Afaka script. It had the Vai script. Europe does not have any more scripts. Europe has very few scripts. Europe has the Roman script. It has the Greek script. It has the Celtic script, which is half and half. It's not entirely European. It has the Russian script. It has 1 or 2 more, just like the African. Many European tribes, just like many African tribes, do not have scripts. The English have no script. We do not write in English script. All we have are Anglo-Saxon sounds. We use the Roman script. The Spanish have no script. The Germans have no script. So it's not a question of being civilized and making up scripts. They didn't make up any scripts. Scripts were brought to them by conquering Europeans. The Romans conquered Britain, and when they conquered Britain, there were no books. There were no writers. In fact, Cicero said, and I quote him, and I think it's rather unfair, but I quote him because he said so. He said, these people are so ignorant, speaking of the Anglo-Saxon, that we are not even sure we can turn them into good slaves. Yet when I was at university, I was being told about how literacy, that the Africans were pre-literate, and literacy began in Europe. We have found Africans writing on the edge of the Sudan, in a place called Kustur. The dynasty of Tarseti, we have found them doing this 200 years before the first Egyptian dynasty. There is nobody else. In Sumer was to come later. The earliest dates we have at Sumer or Babylon is about 2600 BC. We're talking about 3300 BC. So nobody can talk about the African being backward in this regard. Not at all. All these things were brought in, translated into Arabic, which became the language of science. Just as Latin earlier had been the language of scholars, Arabic became the language of science. And Arabic is not just used by Arabs. The Arabic script was invented when Arabia was completely black. It was invented by an African called Abul Aswani. It's recorded in the diaries of Ibn Khalikan, page 661. They are aware of that. So it's not something confined to a certain type of person. Okay, the Arab is not a race, just like the Jew. The Jew is not a race. You have black Jews and white Jews. In fact, the earliest Jews were the dark-skinned types who became, then you have Semitized people coming into that sect. Then you have, in later years, the European type, which became the dominant type, a later Jew. Likewise, among the Arabs or Arabians, you have the fair-skinned type and you have the darker type. And you find with mixtures with the African type, this became even darker. Into Europe they came, and they established 4 dynasties in the heart of Europe. They established the Umayyad dynasty, the Abbasid dynasty, the Almoravid dynasty, and the Almohade dynasty. The Almoravid and the Almohade dynasties were dynasties that were almost completely African, because when the Muslims started fighting among themselves, they would always go back to Africa to regroup. Let me give you an example. The Umayyad set up a dynasty in Europe in 715, and in 750 the dynasty collapsed. Why? Because the Shiites murdered the whole royal family while it was holidaying in Damascus. Then Abdul Rahman built up an African force, charged, he's a Sunni, charged back into Europe, smashed the Abbasid dynasty and renewed the Umayyad dynasty. And the Umayyad dynasty brought many things into Europe. We are not aware of how profound the influence of the Moors were on European science. In fact, I go so far as to say, were it not for the Moors, it is quite possible that the Industrial Revolution would have been delayed by at least a century. The Moors were the first to take water from the mountains and lead it into the private houses by means of lead pipes. They introduced air conditioning in some of the houses. They actually passed the air over a bank of flowers so that they introduced perfumed air conditioning. They were the first to introduce hot and cold water in the houses. They introduced windmills. Nobody had produced windmills knowing that the wind could become a source of power. They introduced mills, paper mills. They introduced the cotton industry into Europe. They introduced the rice industry. They wrote marvelous books on agriculture. You could see a range of them. They advanced that agriculture. They introduced irrigation systems. They introduced worm and pinion gears operated hydraulically. They introduced a range of inventions. Optics, the first eyeglasses in the world were introduced by the Moors. They introduced trigonometry, new concepts in trigonometry. They introduced algebra. Algebra, Europeans did not use algebra, it's an Arabic word. Algebra. Introduced algorithms. They introduced public markets. They introduced public baths. They introduced public libraries into Europe. There was not a single public library then in Europe. They paved the streets. They put lamps on the street. You could walk for miles through Cordova by the flash of lamps. There was not a single lighted street then in Europe. These are the superior Aryans who invented everything. I am not attacking the European, mind you, because certain developments occur in certain places at certain times. Europeans have done marvelous things in science, but they have been arrogant enough to assume that they did these things because they were superior, or they did these things completely out of the blue. If you check it out, you find that when you go to the background of science, you find how much has been lied about. Dr. Finch recently did a study for the book I'm bringing out, Egypt Revisited, in July or August. Did a study of the Edwin Smith papyrus where a surgeon, Egyptian surgeon, had started to rewrite the book which had been used or developed long before him. He did this in the 18th dynasty, around 1,650 years before Jesus. And he only did 1/3 of the book dealing with the head, the neck, the brain. Do you know what the Africans were doing? They had mapped the insides of the brain. They knew the locus in the brain where auditory information was being processed. They could test the pulse. Europeans, the Greeks, were not able to do this until 1,000 years later. Yet, when you read medicine, you hear Herophilus, the Greek. He's the guy who first tested the pulse. And when you read about his test, you see it exactly coming from the Egyptian. Now we have, in all honesty, not only for ourselves, but for all mankind, we have to put the record straight. Because that is the foundation of these myths of superiority. If we do not put them straight, the black will always think he did nothing. I heard my brother say we have to start from scratch, let us face it. And we will always have this arrogance and contempt springing from people who have no ground for arrogance and contempt. What we are here to do is not to prove blacks are superior. There are no superior peoples. We're here to establish that equality is no fantasy. It's no liberal cliche or sentiment. It is rooted in hard historical realities. In the world of the Moors came a number of things which are absolutely critical. I spoke to Congress on July the 7th, 1987. I had been called there because a Congressional Overseas Committee was looking into the workings of the Christopher Columbus Quincentenary Commission. This commission had set up its base. There were no Native Americans. They employed no Native Americans, no blacks. This was going to be a big commemoration in 1992 with just the Italians and the Spanish getting honor and praise for this so-called discovery. And as I pointed out to them, first of all, Columbus never put foot on the American landmass north or south. He only stumbled into the Caribbean. On August the 7th, 1498, 3 of his ships landed in South America, but he did not come off the ship. He said he had arthritis. And he sent a message home that South America was an island. Just as earlier on the second voyage, he sent word home that Cuba was the continent. Just as on the first voyage he came back to say that he was off the continent of Asia, and that the Caribbean was the Gulf of the Ganges. This is the man that we are celebrating in 1992 because he discovered us. He discovered America, thank God, because that enabled them to drag us out of the bush and bring us here and put us in a good footing. Taught us how to dress and how to speak properly. The absurdities, the lies upon which a whole civilization have been built. How can one sleep at night? How can one call a civilization Christian when it is built upon grave immoralities? It is not only us, the black, who carries a burden. The white cannot sleep properly if his civilization is built on lies. Therefore, we've not only come here to save ourselves, we've come to save the world. Because to expose these fictions is absolutely vital. As I pointed out, Mr. Columbus was using a caravel. Do you know what the caravel comes from? Both Columbus and Vespucci were using caravels. The caravel comes from the Moorish caravos. The instruments on their ships, the compass, the Moors had brought in the compass. It had been refined, or rather earlier it had been brought in though they were to refine it further. The astrolabe had been brought in out of Asia, not out of Europe. The sails on the ships of Columbus and Vespucci were Arab Latin sails which Arabs and Africans were using on the Indian Ocean. So what was so marvelous about Christopher? He went out, he struck out for the latitude of Japan, hoping to land in Asia. And then when he landed in the little islands in the Caribbean, he was so frightened he could not go back home and say, sorry man, you wasted your money. I did not find the riches of India. Do you know what Columbus did? He sent his notary, Fernando Perez de Luna, among the ships and made every man sign a document that he was off the coast of Asia. And he threatened his men. If they went back home and said they had not found the edge of, they were not on the edge of Asia, if there were members of his staff, there were officers of the ship, they would be fined 500 maravedis, and if they were common sailors, they would be given 100 lashes and have their tongues cut out. He was not joking. Can't go back home. That's like what happened in my country. So Walter Raleigh, Queen Elizabeth's lover, First Elizabeth, went out to my country to find the Golden City. Didn't find it, went back home, and she chopped off his head. So Columbus couldn't go back and tell Ferdinand and Isabella, I'm sorry. That's a lot of money went down the drain. And that story about the great gold, even as a young man, I heard that the gold was in my jungle because Orinoco, the Golden City, El Dorado, was situated in the Guyana jungle. Jimenez de Quesada, Queen Philip II, Walter Raleigh, all of them came into my jungle searching for the Golden City and met with grief. So when I was 20 years old, I went myself into the bush with a friend of mine searching for the Golden City. Damn fool as I was. So it is this vision of gold, this greed, that drew ship after ship after ship in this direction. And so it wasn't because of the superiority of the ships. China reported that Africans had brought ships to them 2 centuries before Columbus. They had brought elephants in ships. Do you know what it is to take an elephant from Africa to China in a ship? It was not a dugout, clearly not a dugout, and it was not the little ships, caravels of Columbus, because it would have been nice to see a herd of elephants on the Santa Maria. There would have been no celebration in 1992. Even the gun is not European. The first evidence we have of the fire stick, as it is called, is the Moor using the gun in India as the Muslims attacked India. The Europeans took it. They didn't have gunpowder technology, which had been brought out of China by the Moors. Europeans took it, and it became the weapon of great devastation. And look at their number system. The Europeans did not have ciphers. They had numbers, but they did not have ciphers, which are symbols for numbers, which are critical in the development of mathematics. Because to reach a certain height in mathematics, you cannot have a cumbersome letter system. Look at the Romans, who were in advance of the Greeks. How do they count? 1 is 1. 2 is 1, 1. There's no 2. It's 1, 1. 3 is 1, 1, 1. 4 is 1 V. Then 5 is the V. Then 6 is V1. 7 V1, 1. 8 V1, 1, 1. It's all over again. Letters. They did not have ciphers. We owe the ciphers we have today to the Moors. The Moors took it out of India. We do not know how it got into India. When I was speaking at Princeton 2 years ago, I pointed out that several mathematicians had told me that these were Hindu ciphers which the Moors took out of India. When I presented that, a scholar who had studied the Hindu number system said he only found 3 of these shapes among the Hindus, so some of the other shapes must have come from somewhere else. About a year later, a gentleman, a mathematician from Philadelphia, black mathematician, discovered in a book called Mathematical Recreations by Fred Schur a picture of figures, symbols on the step pyramid of Saqqara where there were dancers and there were people, snakes, forming these exact numbers, these symbols, 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 in Egypt. Now we don't know if it's a fraud. Okay, so I cannot say that it developed in Egypt, but the strange thing is that where they said it developed, we've only found 3 symbols resembling that, so we still don't know, but we know it didn't happen in Europe. Fibonacci in 1202 traveled to India where he said he saw some of these symbols. But when he tried to introduce some of them into Europe as symbols that could be used, decimal numbers, the Europeans would have none of it. The church was in charge, and the church was superstitious, and the church said numbers are works of the devil. So that it was not used until the Moors introduced it into the commercial circles from wherever it came. For the time being, we will say it's Hindu until we find people who can tell us. I have sent out to 6 mathematicians to pursue this matter, and we have not been able to go beyond that. But until we can find otherwise, it is clear that it was brought in by the Moors, and whether it originated in India or not, it was brought for certain out of India by the Moors. Now, that was not all. Every major thing, every point of excellence in the world at that time, industrial excellence, was where the Moors were. The carpets of Tulala were the finest in the world. That's where the Moors were. The leather of Morocco was the finest in the world, the tanneries of Morocco. That's where the Moors were. The blades of Toledo were the finest in the world. That's where the Moors were. The iron and brass that was the finest in the world was at Murcia. That's where the Moors were. All of these things. And they brought the finest sashes from Almira, the finest carpets in Tulala, and they brought this incredible agricultural development in Spain at the time after the Moors were kicked out of Spain. Spain went down. It never became the power it was under the Moors. They charged everything. They insisted that education was absolutely important. It was not so in the Christian world at the time. They insisted that baths were important. That was not so at the time. Some people in the church thought that cleanliness is next to godliness was not introduced by the church. Okay, that was introduced by somebody who thought it was good sense. Because part of the Black Death had to do with the fact. There's a book called that deals with the dirt that developed in certain civilizations. You have to be very careful about that. This is not an attack on people. This is an attack on certain ideas, certain concepts that people had that were to profoundly affect them, and other people came in with different ideas. That is the nature of civilization. Primitive cultures do not advance easily because they are closed capsules of culture. Civilizations are open things. You're supposed to take into your system the very best that is available. If you want to study Africa and you want it to be profoundly affected by Africa, you don't eat Africa whole. You take the very best. That is why our lectures deal with the golden threads from Africa. That's why Egypt became great. Egypt drew on the finest things out of Africa. Its hieroglyphs, you could see, you could trace it back in various parts of Africa, you could see the various forms, the animals, etc., the religious ideas. We are now startled to find, when we look at Egyptian ideas of creation, and ideas of creation among the Dogon, ideas of creation among the Bambara, we begin to see the fantastic sophistication involved. The idea that after the primal matter, that there was a growth, a flowering towards consciousness, and that there emerged this incredible power that was the center of consciousness, God, who then reconstituted matter and gave a direction. And the form, the things that before were formless, things that before that were directionless. And you hear in the Egyptian the beautiful poetry when God speaks, I am the morning of times. There is no parallel for that in any other creation story. And they had this tremendous understanding which grew over centuries of settled life. They were the first to enter agricultural settlements. They were the first to domesticate cattle. So there is no backwardness in the African. The tragedy is that we have become so colonized in our imagination. Here is where the colonies are. Because even when some of us have a certain measure of freedom, it is far from total. But even when we have a certain measure of freedom, we would prefer to use a crutch. I can't do anything, man. Don't you see how rough it is here, man? They control everything. And if ever an avenue arose, if ever there was a road, we would not energize ourselves to take that path. To use Farrakhan's phrase, they gave you freedom and you didn't even take a walk. So we have got to use this as power. Ideas are force. That is the vitality. Matter is nothing. It is the spirit. It is this fantastic thing that spins around matter, that turns it around, that gives it power, form, force. That's how the universe was born. God is force. God is power. God is form. God takes that primal matter and reconstitutes it. That's what we do as men, as women. That is what you do in life. You have this thing here, and you do with it what can give direction and beauty and form and morality. So when we go back into history, let us draw upon these essences so that they fill us with a new force. Because it is with this new force, the force that came with the Moors who were to transform the world, both in North Africa. It didn't just end in Europe. When Leo Africanus went down in the 16th century, when all Europe thought that after the slave trade was breaking up and devastating things, that Africa was a wild world, Leo Africanus went down and wrote his marvelous geography and history of Africa, which Shakespeare read. That's why Shakespeare produced the noble Moor, the very best. And then he showed how Africa had all of these internal cities and sophistication. And we seem to forget that because the Europeans came, devastated it, all the connections and continuities were shattered. But it is not a lost world, it is not a finished world, it is in us. Nothing is truly lost once we remember it, once we can reconstitute it, once we can turn it into force in our lives. That, therefore, is our mission. That is the magic and the meaning of the Moors, to be able to draw upon that very special experience, that great conquest that enabled them to transform both Africa and Europe. I want to close by saying, and this is something that reminds me very much of Césaire in his great poem, Return to My Native Land, as he ends with these words, or words similar to these. It is not out of hatred or envy of any race that I proclaim the greatness of my own. It is because I know that no race has a monopoly of genius, intelligence, invention. It is because I know that the race of man is far from finished, that there remains a great deal to be done in the world. The race of man is only just beginning, and there is room for all of us at the rendezvous of history. Thank you.